All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Laura Murray. I'm the president of the National Museum of Language, and I want to a warm welcome to all of you who've signed up for our event today. Uh, we're Before we get into the program itself, I want to give you a brief introduction to the National Museum of Language, so you know a little bit about us. We are a unique, fully online museum. We don't have a building, but we have a website and we offer a lot of programs, uh, speaker programs like the ones you're going to have today. We have exhibits, uh, all relating to various issues of language. We are a nonprofit museum and we're dedicated to examining the history, impact, and art of language. And as a nonprofit, the museum is guided by its mission and is supported by members, donors, and volunteers. So we don't have any affiliation with a larger institution. For example, we're not a government agency. We're not affiliated with a university. We're fully independent. And therefore, this gives us a lot of flexibility in what we can present to those who are interested. Our mission is, as it states on our website, we honor and support language acquisition, which is usually thought of as language learning, utilization, such as how language is used in society, and language preservation, the big issue of these languages that are going extinct around the world. And we also support linguistic and cultural diversity. We celebrate the magic and beauty of human communication through our outreach activities and our online resources. We started this museum. It was started in roughly 1997 with developing some programs and exhibits. And we opened to the public in May of 2008. We had a small physical museum at that time. And our exhibits examine the history, impact, and art of language, but we are completely virtual. You can take a tour of our virtual exhibits on the website. Use a link on our landing page. It will take you there, and you can see types of things that we have. Just to give you a few examples, some of our exhibits include a virtual cruise to Puerto Rico, a new exhibit on international humor, what makes people laugh around the world, the power of poetry, international look at poetry on social justice themes, sharing our stories, which is an exploration of children's stories from around the world. We also have one of our earliest and still most popular exhibits is one of Philagelos, which was a book in Greek of humor dating to about the 4th or 5th century AD. And we have them translated from Greek into English and in cartoons fashion with the cartoons done by our resident artist. And we have speaker programs such as the one that you'll hopefully be enjoying today. The founders and directors of the museum are all language professionals from government, from the world of from academia and the private sector, as well as others that are interested in language. So again, I want to welcome everyone who's online with us today, and we hope you enjoy today's program. So now I'm going to do an introduction of our speaker today. Today we are delighted to welcome Professor Peter Thompson, who is a professor of modern languages and literatures at Roger Williams University, which is located in Bristol, Rhode Island. Now, Professor Thompson has edited 2 widely used anthologies of Francophone literature, and he edits a journal called Ezra, the Online Journal of Translation. And he is the translator of the book Walking the Earth, which we're going to be discussing today, the poetry of Amina Said. In addition to this, he is a very, very experienced translator, especially from French. He's translated about 20 African works mainly from North Africa from French. And he's also translated and written poetry himself, and he's a novelist. Um, in addition, and he also works as the treasurer of a group called the Murdoch Thompson Center for Teachers, which was founded 30 years ago, whose work again is chiefly in Africa. Uh, he's someone who helps his community. He's on the board of Samaritans of Rhode Island. And in a little known piece of information, but it's available in his bio, he's done work and mental health ward for many summers. So we're delighted to have Peter Thompson agree to be our speaker today. Thank you. And we also want to mention that this program has come about through a collaboration with the publisher of Amina Saeed's book, Walking the Earth, the Conundrum Press. It's in New York. So and we are thankful for their cooperation. All right. So I think I'll pass this over to Peter Thompson to proceed.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Laura. Welcome, everyone. You'll see a slide at some point of the book itself. And I just want to mention, of course, that press does a number of great things, but features wonderful translations. The press is Contra Mundo. And this book is the first complete book of Amina Saeed's to be translated. There's one other, and it's selections from her poetry. So this is kind of special that way. She was born in 1953, and she's Tunisian. You need to know that. But I thought what I would do first is just start right in and read one poem in French and then in English. And then we'll talk a little bit more about her and about what I plan to do. So poem one in French. By the way, everything I read today is in order from the very beginning of the book. En tout lieu, régnait la nuit, le rêve en sa première forme. Du ciel déraciné, naquirent le soleil et la lune, l'ombre, la lumière et la sève. Et ce désir de créer entre feu et larmes, le ciel déraciné. Le plume, toi et moi, marcher sur la terre. So number one in English. All around, night and dream reigned in primal form. From an uprooted sky, sun and moon were born, shadow, light, and sap. And this desire to create amid fire and tears. The uprooted sky. We were able, you and I, to walk the earth. So I should mention that she's lived in France quite a long time, a couple of decades, a little more than that. And that much of her exile is during the dictatorship of Ben Ali in Tunisia. So you can imagine that's a self-exile. Most of the writers I talk about it, in fact, the theme of exile will involve mostly writers who self-exiled. Quite a number of these North Africans, exile themselves in France. That's a common thing. It's the case with her. She's been translated into about 5 languages. You might remember that Arab Spring in 2011 began in Tunisia. So that's under this same dictatorship of Ben Ali. It was a street vendor, I think a fruit vendor, who set himself on fire. He was so fed up with the authorities. And that was the very beginning of Arab Spring. But before that, Amina Saeed had exiled herself to France. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read most of the poems. There'll only be 5 or 6 more in English at some point, just to break up the talking. There'll be mostly in English, maybe one or two more in French. And then what I want to do at the very beginning is just reassure everyone, this is in a way a very simple book. Probably because her themes repeat themselves, and partly because she's invoking a very simple, bare, stripped down image of a world. It's almost like a post-apocalyptic world. You could call it that or call it something else, but it's, it's a bit like the world in Waiting for Godot, a Samuel Beckett kind of world that's very lean and bare in terms of imagery, but also in terms of just one or two themes that repeat themselves: deprivation and desolation. It's not all depressing either. It's a way of underlining a kind of hope and courage, right? But that said, that makes it to me a simple and intriguing book. And what I want to do is keep this talk oriented to her feelings and her themes without it becoming a very intellectual exercise. Okay, she's, Tunisia is what you call a post-colonial situation, right? All the North African countries, in fact, all the African countries were colonized. So we describe that as a post-colonial world, and you may know there are entire academic courses and books, a great deal of theoretical work called post-colonial theory. So that's not what we're going to do. Inevitably, the key personal things, the key things that have to do with your life and your feelings that intersect with that situation of being in the post-colony or being exiled or self-exiled from a post-colonial situation like Tunisia. Those things will intersect, cross over, and so there'll be a few things we mentioned that people who talk a lot about post-colonial theory also mention, but that doesn't make this a deeply intellectual or theoretical talk, okay? All right. I also have a way of unifying the entire talk. It's just my take on language and poetry and her poetry in this book. And that unity is betweenness, the idea of betweenness. So keep that in mind. I'll keep coming back to it, but I'm going to divide that betweenness into three areas. And we might talk for 50 minutes or so about each area. One is exile itself. You can readily imagine that, in terms of your being, yourself, your experience, what I might call, what you often call your ontology, branch of philosophy that deals with being, your actual being, if you're Amina Said, is somehow hung up between Tunisia and France, right? If you're exiled anywhere, you're somehow in a between state, mentally, emotionally. It's inevitable. We'll go into that, but you can see how there are two things and you're between them, the country you came from and the country you're exiled to. Another betweenness is a question of language, and this being the Museum of Language, we want to spend some time on that. An issue there that is obvious, and you probably thought of it, is why does she write in French and not Arabic? Why do North African writers often write in French? Why does a Caribbean writer not write in Martinican or Haitian Creole, so on? So we have to get to the bottom of that. There's no such thing as a North African writer who hasn't been asked that question, or hasn't dealt with it deep inside, and hasn't fashioned some kind of answer to that question, right? Why do I write in French? So a little bit of that. That's a betweenness, right? You're between Arabic and French in your mind, inevitably. And I'm simplifying when I say Arabic. We'll explain why. But that's a kind of betweenness. imagine it's a very alive kind of betweenness. If you're a writer, you're a poet. We'll talk a little bit about how that's catalytic. That's something that's alive in the act of poetry. While you're in the act of creation, you're somewhat hung up in that betweenness, or you can be sometimes voluntarily between two languages. And then to make the language section on betweenness even deeper, since it's the language museum, we can talk about translation itself. And obviously, when you translate, there's a betweenness. It involves two languages, two poles that you alternate between, two states that you move between, right? Two languages. And in this case, we're not talking about her being hung up between Arabic and French. We're talking about me, being hung up between her French and our essentially American English, right? But any translator is dealing with a betweenness, but it's a very intriguing one. It's really worth going into a little bit. And the third angle of betweenness, I'm sure we'll have time, certainly hope so, but if we don't, it's simply something that applies to all poetry. It might be fun to talk about. Does anyone need me to check my sound? I have my computer all the way up. Just not sure. Are we okay? Any more I can do? Okay. That is metaphor. Metaphor applies to a great deal of poetry, especially modern poetry, especially modern poetry in, let's say, in the West, since Baudelaire, Rimbaud, the Surrealists. Modern poetry, that is, that features the image, sometimes called phanopoeia, the poetry of image rather than the poetry of sound. So modern poetry that features the image, that is a kind of metaphor, is the angle I'm taking here, rather than, poetry that's metrical and that most of the satisfaction comes from music or meter. We'll be looking at metaphor. And the reason we're calling that a betweenness is the obvious fact that metaphor is two things as well. Just as we mentioned, two countries if you're exiled, and two languages if you're a translator, two languages if you're a self-exiled person. In this third area betweenness, metaphor, there are also two poles, two things you're in between. When you're comparing one, in a metaphor, you're comparing one thing to another thing, right? So those are the two things, and you're in between them. And to me, always an exciting way. That's the fun part of poetry. That's the beautiful part to see. Usually the stimulating or shocking, surprising, interesting part of modern poetry, as long as those two things, the metaphor is not overly cliched and worn out, like your hands were cold as ice. It doesn't do anything for you. But when a poet like Amina Said comes up with a new metaphor, I want to talk towards the end, if we have time, about what that feels like and how it acts upon us, right? Okay, so first of those three elements in betweenness is exile. And I'm going to read in a minute her words on this, tell you how that came about. But they're really something. They're really striking. I've read a lot of this stuff from various people, and I've talked to a lot of my authors that I translate. Her communication to me was the deepest and also most beautifully written that I know of on the subject of exile and poetry and the ontology, the personal side of exile. So I'll read her words on that. But first, the background of this for me and for all of us, if you're interested in North African poetry, will involve a few names that I'll go into. Reda Benzmaya, Algerian, the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, who writes a lot about, he writes about what he calls deterritorialization, sort of unwedding yourself from territory. And that has been very interesting to a couple of North African writers I know. Ben Zmaya is one. Nabil Fabez is another. I'll mention him several times. That's Fares, Fabez. And that deterritorialization could be of people, of issues, of texts, there's poems, a way of making territory not the main issue. And we want to get around to the idea of nations, making nations not the main issue. If you're talking about exile, you're talking about someone who has traded nations, or given up one nation for another. So for people who feel this deeply, like the exiled person, or people who think deeply about it, like the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, that's something catalytic. That's something. There's some agency. That's something moving in the way you operate. If you're a writer, you know, stripping yourself of nationality or nationhood, or questioning what nationhood is all about. You can get partway there thinking about what we're calling nationalism right now, which is maybe overdone in this country with some people. And in France, if you hear the cry among the right wing, France for the French, or the anti-immigrant movements in Germany and Hungary and elsewhere, including here, where the idea of nationhood is an overblown, oversimplistic and exclusive kind of thing. It's also historically, you know, a somewhat arbitrary thing, right? You might think that our nationhood as America is not arbitrary at all. Let's not get into that particularly, but I want you to just think a bit about African nationhood and what it means to be an African from literally any African country, not just North Africa. What does nationhood mean to you? We start with the idea in this talk of Amina Said, to some extent rejecting one nation and exiling herself to France. In fact, to a country that had, you know, conquered and colonized her country and was not particularly good in all its methodology when it did that, but still preferring to live in that country than to live under the dictatorship of Tunisia. It's not just rejecting bad conditions in Tunisia. And you can see when you read this book that it seems to be a rejection of any notion of, and that one thing about the title, by the way, is you're walking the whole earth. So it seems to be across boundaries, or what we would call without borders, right? And that phrase you hear a lot, without borders, language without borders, words without borders. The idea here is for a writer, what it comes down to for a human, for a thinking, feeling human, and you really get that feeling from this book, for a thinking, feeling human, how important is some historical, sometimes arbitrary notion of nationhood, right? And where that's particularly arbitrary, where I want to bear down on the Africa scene, is remember most of the boundaries, the things that we think of as making a nation. If you hear an ultra-nationalist say, nation, language, borders, the borders are the deal. Keep the immigrants out of the borders. These are our borders. This is what makes our nation. By the way, we have one language. This has been overdone in the case of Algeria. I'll bring that up later. But we're trying to transcend that sometimes. Many of the thinkers I talked to, many of the Africans I talked to, completely transcended that. And it wasn't hard for them when you consider that their borders and their nations were just created by the colonizers, just created by outsiders, created by the British and the French and so on. Right? So why would you have any particular respect? for example, for a border that was designed to keep tribes either apart or to keep them warring with each other, cheek by jowl within the same border, so that the colonial power had an easier time because the tribes were at each other's throats all the time. That's the nature of these borders. It's to a large extent the nature of the definition of nation. If you're defining Tunisia or Algeria, it comes down to that. In the geographical political sense. But to a poet, and an African poet, for the reasons I've just said, to an African poet, and then thirdly to an African poet who has left that nation, living in another nation. The whole idea for Amina Said living in France of crossing boundaries, walking the earth becomes very seductive. The whole idea of clinging to some kind of nation becomes very reductive and simplistic and kind of absurd. Right? There are lots of examples tied to this. Why would Abdel Latif Labi, a great Moroccan poet, who was arrested and tortured and imprisoned for something, a couple of things he said in his literary journal in Morocco, and now lives in France. Why would he think of Morocco as his nation? Undoubtedly, he does go back to visit now. He can do that without any danger, just as Tunisians I know go back to visit Tunisia and so on. But no doubt, these visits are to a landscape and to family and to villages, rather than to the idea of a monarchy, which Morocco is, to a nation that had a security apparatus that tortured him in the name of some kind of national security. So a guy like Abdel Latif Labi has surely transcended simplistic idea of nationhood, right? And I want to add a layer to all this, because it'll come up some more when we get to the language question, actually. The Northern Africans were invaded and conquered by Arabs from the East and converted to Islam in the 700s AD. So that even a nation like Algeria, after defeated the French in 1962, the winning and ruling party has ever since, according to Algerian writers that I talked to, has ever since overdone the idea of one nation, one language, one religion. So the one religion is Islam, but when you think about it, that Islam was imposed, just the way many centuries later French rule was imposed in Algeria. How about the language? The language and the religion were both imposed. Islam was imposed. So that to someone like Amina Said and to Nabil Fares, the Algerian I mentioned before, the real language, the native language, is often Berber. The population was Berber before it was conquered by the Arabs. I talked to Berbers in Northern Africa that feel that very strongly. They speak resentfully of Arabization, as it's sometimes called. It's less forceful politically in some countries than that Algerian situation I described, one nation, one religion, one language. But it's still the coin of the realm. To get ahead in business, you have to learn Arabic. To get through high school and function in the modern world all through North Africa, you learn Arabic. You may speak Berber, but you learn Arabic. And that complicates the idea of what a nation is, right? You can see how there are layers to this that go back centuries. So that even if it weren't a question of the French and the British and the colonizers in Africa, it would still be a question of the Arab invasion and what your roots really are as a poet, what your sense of nation is, or if we're transcending that, if we're transcending borders and even language, going back to Berber language, and then what's your sense of where you belong, your sense of a land, when you might loosely call a country, your sense of a country you belong to or land you belong to, culture you belong to. This culture, going way back, would have been Berber culture, right? Which is in some areas is making a comeback, and which is very important to some North African writers today. So this is the background of exile. It's an inevitable part for Africans. In the context today will be North Africans, an inevitable part of the exile. It's those elements of simplistic, reductive nationalism that are being transcended in this book, Walking the Earth. But I just wanted to be super clear, and this is all, I hope, done without, a lot of post-colonial theory, but we have to know that much. It's all done by Amina Said in a stripped down way that makes you feel the humanity of the situation. These are just people walking the earth. There's no reference to nationhood or rivalries, geopolitical rivalries, or language prestige, or anything like that. So I'll read you something she said about this. I just asked her at some point if she had any comment about it, because I was getting a very good preface from Professor Jawad, and I'll read some of that too. He's a Tunisian. I just thought something occurred to me. Her thoughts would be super valuable, especially from the angle I'm taking. Just kind of the non-theoretical, theoretical, kind of human feeling angle. And so she wrote, it was in French, I'm going to read it in English, but she wrote, as I said before, one of the deepest, most beautiful things I've read in this kind of area. So here we go. This is about half of what she wrote. This quest for place is born of a profound feeling of exile. Isn't any creative person exiled, a nomad, an eternal wanderer seeking a place, a utopia, a place imaginary, impossible, dreamed of, which poetry can, with a sudden flaring, show in an unforeseeable image, a symbolic place, thanks to which any feeling of exile will be abolished, where a being might arrive at a kind of unity, and elsewhere that evokes in us a sense of the sacred, a desire to accede to transcendence, and elsewhere that responds to deeply spiritual aspiration and merges with the search for self. These poems remain haunted by birthplace, the other shore of the Mediterranean. So she's in France, the other shore is Tunisia, right? The original place that links to childhood and irrigates memory. So writing becomes a return to that non-temporal episode, which is childhood. Distance from those landscapes perhaps explains their obstinate resurgence through and in my writing, as if I'm trying to remain inscribed in them, with memory serving to fill the hollows of absence. And absence, this other name for exile, when it is positive, can open onto a new birth. She quotes herself, and out of my own absence, I am born to myself. So you can see that that's said with feeling. It touches on a couple of things we said. She's assuming a lot that I thought I should spell out first about the background, a large background for almost any North African writer, right? But that was really rich. I won't I won't dissect that, but speaking of absence, there's a kind of passivity and personal well, she says transcendence. That works for us so far in this talk in terms of transcending borders, right? But she seems to be transcending more than that. When you read the poems, you feel that. But she mentioned it. That was her word. Kind of transcendence of many things in daily life that you do when you write poetry. You can imagine that. When you read this particular poetry, you will get a chance to do a little more of that. You can see that the flavor of her transcendence is pretty special. It does have that kind of absence she mentions. Professor Joad will call it silence. Some poetry is, more silent, and the poet himself or herself seems more absent, or, of course, that's not quite the right word for all poets, but more receptive rather than assertive. It's good for poets to be receptive rather than assertive. That's in some ways what she's talking about. Modern poetry, where the image, a sudden, flashing, powerful, strange metaphor comes into play, works because the poet has figured out how to be receptive. Remember, for the surrealists, Salvador Dali and those people who are the masters of these strange images, they coined that whole word, that whole notion of a kind of passivity that leads to this poetic receptiveness. She's in some ways an inheritor of theirs. The French surrealists were very important in North Africa. So in some ways, that's what she's hinting at there. She speaks of absence. She says there's the more literal meaning of absence when you're in exile. You're absent from Tunisia, but as all kinds of people who live in America who are immigrants or who don't, for some reason, don't feel this is really their country, or it isn't really their country yet, they can feel somehow absent from the scene even when they're present, right? Just hinting at that as well. So we're still in this topic of exile. That's the that's the best chunk of it right there. Her words on that. But what I want to underline in what she said and what I tried to say at the very beginning when I said this would be a simple talk is that it works better for today's talk and for enjoying this book and for enjoying her purpose. It works better not to think of exile as a theme or a notion that's embedded in post-colonial theory. It works best to think of it as a condition. I don't think she used that word. I want to stress that. It's a condition. Elsewhere, I think I'll call it a state, maybe, but for the person, it's a human condition. It's the condition you're in. If you're a professor going on and on about post-colonial theory, you're going to talk about it as a theme and as a historical accident and all kinds of things. But that's to ignore the human feelings attached to it. It's a condition that recent immigrants here know. And if you spent a couple of years abroad in one stretch, you felt it sort of. That's what comes through in the poetry, and she kind of strains it and makes it her own brand of poetry. But it's her life as well. For all these writers, and speaking about a whole group, I've mentioned a few names that live in France and so on. It's an everyday thing. It's their life. It's their condition. It's a betweenness because they're never fully French. They're partly Moroccan. They're partly Tunisian. They're partly Algerian. They have moments when their heart and mind are in the old country, not to call it a nation, but the old country. There are moments when they're perhaps thinking in Berber or Arabic, and there are moments when they're alienated. They feel alienated. Not to mention moments when French people make them feel alienated. As 3 generations of Algerians can tell you, that's a very real thing. Many of them still live in what they call it HLM, that are sort of ghetto areas outside Paris. So it's it's a condition, not an idea. It's a condition, not a theme. Okay. So just a last thought on exile as one of the 3 betweennesses, and related to this idea of a condition. If you're exiled, what are you exiled from? It's too simple to say you're exiled from the dictatorship in Tunisia, or you're exiled from a nation that has chased you away. This happened to Nasira Massouz, an Algerian writer. When I translated her and was emailing her, she was in Algeria working as a journalist, a novelist, and poet. During that time, pressure from the authorities was so great on her that she self-exiled to Montreal. You're exiled from that. That's sort of obvious. But it's also that you're exiled from things you love, and that you're never fully exiled from that place, right? And then there's, what are you exiled to? You're exiled to something that you're never fully a part of. Generally speaking, this is the case. And if you're dark-skinned and so on in Northern Europe, even more the case. You're never fully part of it. You're exiled to something that you're not fully part of. And obviously you're exiled from something that you're mostly separated from, but not fully. Right? So that's a kind of betweenness. That I'm trying to make this seem more an everyday reality, a condition, a feeling, and less geographical fact. And if you think of what a creative person does, she hints at creative people, right? Aren't poets all nomads? She's suggesting that any poet is seeking a place. I'm saying you're exiled from something but not fully, and to something but not fully. There's the betweenness. And the place that she writes from is that betweenness. And she's pretty much spelled it out in what I just read. But I want you to think of the creative nature of a poet, and what place does any poet write from? She said any creative person in what we just cited. What place does a creative writer write from? Most of us think we transcend a lot of things to get to a creative spot. Right? The creative spot that an exiled person writes from is this between spot that people are describing several different ways, right? And that's even, I would guess, even more catalytic, even more active in their creative process than it is for run-of-the-mill regular American poet, myself or someone else, who is or hopes that he or she is transcending a lot of things to get to a good poem. This is an automatic betweenness that is furnishing the transcendence, right? Someone like Amina Said. Okay. All right, well, it's a pretty good run-up, I think. I'm going to read one more in French, and then that's poem number 2, and then it in English. And then 3 more in English. That won't take very long. That's what I'm up to. Number 2 in French. Le mot juste frappe au cœur du cœur. L'horizon est patient pour les marcheurs immobiles battant leur démesure. Nous avons déserté les villes pour habiter l'espace du seul cri. Cercle de pierres nues, quelqu'un raconte nos fables tristes. Nous rallumons les braises dans l'eau noire, brandissons nos mains coupées vers l'asile du ciel. De quel pays venez-vous, demande-t-on, et où naîtront vos enfants? Où serez-vous lorsque, sous le sourire sanglant des nuages, ils chercheront un sein de chair? So number 2 in English. The mot juste strikes in the heart of hearts. The horizon is patient for stilled walkers, keeping to the beat of their excesses. We abandon villages to settle in the space of a lone crowd. A circle of bare stones, someone recites our sad fables. We rekindle our embers in black water, brandish our severed hands at the sky. What country are you from? Someone asks. Where will your children be born? Where will you be when under the clouds' bloody smile they fumble for a fleshy breast? So poem number 3 in English. I'm going to read these just the way you are off the screen. Unless that goes awry, I think it'll work. All paths lead to the same place. Journey is illusion's horseback. World's embers blacken its wanton footstep. They burn our anxious tongues. Within its form, the poem seeks itself. It's this black water that dazzles us when we give it back the far glimmer of a star. So number 4 in English. Night settles over the day. We gaze full-eyed upon life. Love invents us and speaks the senses' language. Aureole of silence before our lips, bringing us the echo of a childhood land, the memory ceremony. We regain the shore of an unknown sea. Waves in succession dissemble the heaving. We will gather always the night falling within us like a black nail into flesh's very flesh. Ringed on every side, the day wears down unknown to us. It sculpts on our secret face a singular mask. So we'll do one more in this chunk, and that's 5 in English. If we have time, there are a couple more. My shadow recognizes yours. Your shadow recognizes mine. Their rebel fingers rifle the dark. Looks exchanged can only belong to night. Guardian shadows lying in wait for mirrors. Like scolding birds, they unfurl rumpled wings. Their formal shares barely touch on their double nature. So I do hope you get to enjoy this book. You'll see certain lines and ideas repeated. You'll never be at a loss to understand what she's trying to do. It's more feeling, is quite palpably a feeling of exile, people wandering, not knowing where they're wandering towards. Some of it is bleak. Some of it even suggests wartime. A lot of it suggests desolation. But there are reasons for having this stripped down landscape. I suggested it's a bit like Samuel Beckett. If you ever see that play, Waiting for Godot, it's usually just a bare, kind of wrecked looking small tree and a couple of rocks. That's the stage setting. And if you read his novels, especially as they peter out, as they towards the end of his production, it's people wandering pretty much aimlessly. It's some kind of modern take, on Amina Said's life overlapped with Beckett's in his production. It's some kind of suggestion, a modern take on saying that we're courageous and we stagger on without overstating it or saying it in an old-fashioned way, full of ideas and imagery and numerous themes and well enunciated, clear passages. Instead, it's suggestive in the way she hinted at in her kind of absence that she describes. And we'll do a little more with that because Professor Jawad has described, this is a wonderful introduction he did. He's described the poetry a bit. So what I want to do now is the middle section of our three ideas of betweenness, and that is language itself. I think I'll speed this section up a little bit. This comes right out of, one chapter of the huge discussion of post-colonialism. But it's the question of why would you write in French? Why, when they're the bad people, they're the ones who colonized you. They're, in many cases, the ones who set up the recent dictator or the dictator before him. So if you've never gone into this question, as I said, every North African writer has an answer for it and has thought deeply about it. Rita Benzmaya told me, well, there's no point in me writing in Berber. I wouldn't sell any books. Berber isn't something that's really, in Morocco, 47% of the people are illiterate. I don't know what it is in Algeria, but it's the villages in Algeria. No one's writing down the Berber that they speak, or even the Algerian version of Arabic. In Morocco, it's Darija, the version of Arabic is largely not written down. So even if you wrote in Darija, Moroccan Arabic, that everyone speaks in the marketplace, you wouldn't sell a lot of books. How do you sell a lot of books? How do you be a writer? How do you get people to read? It's not about selling and making money, right? But how do you get people to read your poetry or read your thoughts or theoretical thoughts in the case of Benzmaya, Ferez to some extent? You write in French, or if it's from Nigeria, you write in English. You may know Chinua Achebe, who wrote Things Fall Apart. It's taught now in many schools, middle school, high school. He has said several things about this that are different. I'm sure one of the things, I haven't read it, but I'm sure one of them is, well, I would like people to be able to read my books. But he's also said that his tongue is Igbo. But if you add all the Hausa and Yoruba people in Nigeria together, that's most of them. Most people wouldn't be able to read his books if he wrote Things Fall Apart in Igbo, right? In fact, if you wrote it in Hausa or Yoruba, half or more of the nation wouldn't be able to read it. And that's a segment who are literate to begin with. And there are a great many people out far from schools in Africa that are not literate. Still a huge problem. So that's one thing he has concretely has said about it. Chinua Achebe has said, but he's also said that it's interesting to him to reach out to another culture, to be, thinking along in Igbo and thinking about the village that he describes in Things Fall Apart, but to be embracing some other culture as he does that, which is English language. There are probably Africans who say, I don't get that, I don't get that explanation. But for most people who are trying to transcend, after all, their own village, their own language, their own tribe, there is something to that. If you happen to be an educated African who knows one or two African languages, but also English or French, very few of them think that is a loss or something that's a curse or something that they shouldn't exercise or something that isn't of some value when they're doing creative work. So he has suggested that. You think of some other three very famous people, Ngugi, that's Ngugi, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he's a Kenyan. He wrote Petals of Blood and a couple of other classics. He finally said, in a kind of theoretical vein, I'm done writing in English. Now I'm going to write in, my African language, which is Kikuyu. So he did that for a while, and then he changed his mind and went back to English. You can imagine a few reasons for that. He has taken one side of that argument, at least for a while. The two founders of the Negritude movement, which was 30s and 40s mostly, but it went on 50s, 60s, 70s. The two founders of that kind of Black Pride movement in African literature, Césaire from Martinique and Senghor from Senegal. They had their own explanations as well. They both wrote in French. Aimé Césaire is famous for thinking, well, French is it's kind of the spoils of war. We won. We have our independence. Not exactly true, by the way. Martinique voted to remain part of France, and it's as much part of France as Hawaii is the United States. But of course, culturally, that was a negotiation, and culturally, it's its own thing, and they're not under a colonial thumb. It's not a slave state anymore. So that's what he's referring to, I guess. But he speaks of and others have spoken of the booty, the spoils of war, which are the French language. Here's a thing we got. The colonizer will say, look what we gave you, roads, hospitals, schools, that you didn't have before. So the colonized person doesn't buy that and isn't dwelling on that, but also language. And the colonized writer who writes in French is always asked to explain that. And will sometimes say, well, that's what we got. We won. We have this thing. We have this French. It's just one thing. It's one tool among many. Thank you. We have your language. We're going to use it. By the way, we'll use it the way we want. Césaire is particularly famous for kind of torturing the language and making up unusual words, using it to insult certain French manners and even French logic, Cartesian logic, that kind of thing. Senghor, his comrade in arms, they met at the Sorbonne in Paris, who co-founder of the Negritude movement, has said a slightly different thing. So this is about 4 or 5 different things of angles I've quoted. I'm not a North African, I'm quoting North Africans and Caribbeans, West Africans on this subject. Senghor has taken a different line. What he has said is, for some things that I'm thinking about, rarely writing about, but things I'm thinking about, I think in my African language. There's more than one. His mother was from one tribe and his father was from another. But when I'm doing certain kinds of work, French is what works. It works best. I use French for poetry and for a few other things. My theoretical writings about negritude. French is a very clear language. It works very well for theoretical writing, abstract ideas, and so on. So he has kind of 2 ways of looking at it. He has several languages in his head, but he's perfectly clear that French may be more useful for certain things, right? So these are all ways. There are probably half a dozen more that writers have spoken about this. If you've never thought about it, I wanted to get those in there. It's not an obvious way of taking down a writer to say to someone like Amina Said, what's wrong with you? Why don't you write in Arabic? You know? And so let's get back to the Berber issue. Arabic was forced on North Africa, and now it is something of a lingua franca because across North Africa you get by different dialects of Arabic, but often they're Egyptian Arabics, very different from Moroccan, so that often doesn't even work. But it's not that's sort of transactional in the business life, right? There are writers who insist on writing in Arabic, so they have to write it in Arabic that you would learn in school. It's not really the same as the Arabic that most North Africans speak in the first place, but they write in Arabic because it's also a beautiful and clear language, and they learned it in school, and they want to reach out to a wide audience. It's a fairly wide audience. It's not as wide an audience, especially depending on what they're writing about. You know, they're writing kind of a racy. I have two writers I've translated, women who wrote kind of racy novels. They couldn't even publish them in their own country. So you're trying to publish it in Europe. You know, you're not going to be writing in Arabic. But writing in Arabic, you have a fairly wide audience. You're already writing in the conqueror's language because the Arabs were conquerors in the 700s AD. You're already writing in an Arabic that's not the Arabic, generally called MSA, Modern Standard Arabic, not the Arabic that most North Africans speak every day, nor would they know how to write the Arabic that they speak every day. So it's almost absurd. It's wrong to say, why don't you write in Arabic? And yet, there are plenty of writers, North African writers, who say, this is the deal. I'm being more true to myself. I'm being more true to my roots. I'm writing in Arabic. At least one big deal critic, Pierre Joris, he has a wonderful website. A lot of it is to do with North African literature. It's called Nomadics. His name is Joris, Joris. He has repeated a quote about how in the last few decades, the literature that's written in Arabic by North Africans, to him and others, is not particularly memorable. It's called by some empirical classical, and somewhat stilted and not as memorable as the stuff written in French. Very adventurous, very influenced by Rimbaud, by the French surrealists, by the French New Novel writers in the 1950s and 60s, people like Robbe-Grillet and Nathalie Sarraute, New Novel, people who revolutionized the novel. Novelists like Nabil Fabez are influenced by them. So to me and others, that literature written in French in North Africa is very exciting. Let's not necessarily say it's better or more exciting, but very exciting. It has a very, very wide audience. Okay, we're trying to make it even wider by translating it into English, but it has a very wide audience. If you go to bookstores in Northern Europe, you see these writers in French. An example of a certain writer I'm going to drop out, his name is Abdel Khabir Khatibi. Very interesting because he invented something called the bilang, not bilingual, but long with an A, like language, bilang, where he's in between French and Berber in his mind as he writes. And the preface to something I translated of his called Tattooed Memory. Tattooed Memory goes into that. It's easy to read about him and his invention of what he calls the bilang. That's a betweenness. And you can imagine this language question that we've been discussing now for 10 minutes is all about a betweenness. Songor being between, choosing between which language he's thinking when he's writing, right? It's a type of betweenness. I think for the moment, I'll skip over what I was going to do with translation, because I want to read what Joanne said about her poetry itself. And if there's time, we can come back to that. this will leave time, since we're talking about poetry itself, to talk about metaphor, which is really fun, and how metaphor is the third type of betweenness, right? I want to, well, let me read what Professor Jawad says in his introduction. He is Tunisian. He's also written a book about Rimbaud, which is key if you're, North African. A lot of you know Rimbaud is very influential in modern poetry, 17-year-old phenomenon in 1870, who the forefather of the Surrealists is one of it. And Jawad also wrote another book about Surrealism and its influence on African poetry. We tend to, in America, Surrealist poetry never really caught on that much. We tend to think of Salvador Dali when we think of Surrealism, but that gives you a pretty good idea of strange imagery and what Dali himself thought of as a receptiveness, the kind of state you had to get into to have those images come to you. So here's one thing Jawad says. By reenacting our ancestral nomadic condition, Said simultaneously reawakens to our increasingly sedentary contemporaries our common genetic impulse and sense of wanderlust. This urge to, as a quote from her, regain the shore of an unknown sea. Break from familiar habits and constraints to experience the mysterious and the uncharted. But more importantly, she revisits with fresh eyes the familiar topoi of displacement and belonging, identity and alterity, and connections between the self and other people, especially between topography and biography and autobiography, investing them with new meaning and contemporary relevance. Even though Said's poetic world, essentially an ontological quest, seems to be devoid of local specificity. That's the kind of stripped down quality I'm talking about. There are distinct flashes and echoes of the childhood land, of an intimate filial experience sourced in the fertile grounds of her double heritage, a rhythmic oscillating between cultures and languages. There's the betweenness across the Mediterranean, between the fatherland, Tunisia, and the motherland, France. In these echoes, we hear the father's lament as he berates his child's exilic predicament, now a refugee on the other shore. This is a quote from Said. My father says, I'm in the suburbs of death, and the silence that follows cannot still time. So there, without beating on it too hard, you can see Jawad is picking up on the betweenness of exile, and he's mentioned geography as well as culture, and a kind of sense of separation to some extent, a sense of loss. There's this sense, of the father condemning you if you're self-exiled and the father's back in the old country. Wafa Gorbel, who's another Tunisian that I translated. The novel I did is Black Jasmine, but it's in 3 or 4 languages now. She mentions in that novel she's only spent her college years in Paris, and then went back to Tunisia. But she mentions when she went back, a kind of culture shock, and how relatives, we're speaking of the father quote from Say just now, but how her relatives would kind of berate her about certain things that in ways in which she had changed and become more Western or more French, right? And in her eyes, they had become more limiting, because they're limiting of women's freedoms. She goes back and finds that women have no freedoms at all, and they think that she has assumed too many freedoms, right? So that's part of the separation, is one aspect of exile that Jawad mentions in the last quote. I'll just do another little bit of his. Said writes about intimate, sensitive, and secret worlds dominated by absence and silence. But it is silence that best finds her voice, her register to express the depths of her emotions. Like no other, Said gives voice to silence, parses the silence that lies at the heart of movement, so well observed by the ancient Chinese sages who said, in all stillness there must be movement, in all movement there must be stillness. It's an ancient Chinese saying, walking the earth is filled with both movement and stillness. The stillness, I'm trying to suggest is kind of what Said is calling absence, what Jawad is calling silence or stillness. It's the kind of receptivity, being open. And the subject we're about to jump to, being open to metaphor. How does a strange metaphor come to you? How does poetry come to you? Right? The volume is framed like a mystery film by a haunting subterranean silence, and more specifically, white silence. Its soundtrack, another quote, death all around is a white silence, commented by the gardens, a silence fathomless. This white silence drowns out all other sounds, inducing in the reader a sense of foreboding, of otherworldly strangeness, tension, and confusion, yet all tempered by flashes of familiarity, serenity, and illumination. I'm suggesting that those flashes are on a positive side. The white silence somehow leaves space for something to arrive that's positive. If you're a poet, if you're creative, it's the creative moment, the creative act, the metaphor, the image, the perfect creative statement, the perfect poem, the perfect line. That's what Keats, this is kind of famous, you've heard of this, called negative capability. When he said it, Western European poetry and so on was dominated by logical construction, along with meter and rules about meter and rhythm and so on. But also that, your metaphor and everything you said had to be pinned to some kind of common sense or logical proposition, right? The metaphor had to be logically understandable. And Keats is suggesting that's human and natural, but negative capability is the artist's friend. It's a way of negating all that, being open to something else. It's the silence Jawad is talking about, or the absence or passivity that Said is talking about. I throw that in there because many of you are familiar with negative capability, and that's a way connected to a great deal of modern poetry too. It's Keats who said it, but this is the heart of what Salvador Dali called paranoid critique. Paranoid critique. Your critical faculty is your mind is ready to seize on something that's a perfect image or metaphor, but you have to be like paranoid in your sensitivity and be receptive, not assertive, and maybe it'll come to you, right? So we're jumping, as I said, to metaphor, soul of a piece, and that is the third kind of betweenness. And we might have a minute to talk about translation, which fits back in the language piece, which was the middle kind of betweenness we're talking about. Sort of obvious one. Translation is betweenness. So metaphor, I'll give you one we just read. Night falling within us like a black nail. Now, in olden times, that would fail the logic test. You might be able to explain it logically, but it wouldn't strike a poet like Milton or Pope or someone as clear enough. Whereas, we've grown up with modern poetry, stuff that T.S. Eliot, inherited from the French symbolists, who in turn inherited it from Rimbaud. It's this kind of very strong metaphor that Eliot spoke of as being sort of like a catalyst, where you might have things in your mind that are stirring together. You kind of come up with an image. If you're Amina Saeed, night is falling within us is already kind of an image. It could be an image of depression or weariness, of despair. But she's groping for something to compare that to. In Eliot's terms, some kind of catalyst creates perfect peg to hang these ideas on. The idea of despair, let's say, and the idea that it's like night falling within us is already a bit of a metaphor. But to make it stronger, you're receptive to some non-logical, slightly weird image that may come to you. To Eliot, there's a catalyst, modern poetry, catalyst that creates this strong metaphor. And it's the black male. So if you had to struggle with the logic of it, you might come up with stuff like, well, the nail is made of metal, so it's cold. When you say black, it makes it seem even colder. If you think of a black piece of metal going through you, that's like falling within you, like falls within us. It works. I mean, you don't have to approach it logically like that. You get it right away. It may seem a bit strange. It would seem strange to Milton or Pope, but you get it right away. To me, the reason these kinds of strong metaphors, really any metaphor that works, is a betweenness. It's a simple thing. I just wonder if you've ever thought about it as a creative moment. You have two things you want to compare, or you have one thing and you want to come up with something that's more suggestive. So you're comparing two things. You haven't come up with the second one yet. You're the guy that wrote the Highwayman, the poem, Highwayman. The road was a ribbon of moonlight over the purple moor. So the moor is, the moor is up and down. If you look at a sandy road in the old days, it goes over one hill and down and up. It winds. It looks like a ribbon. And if it's in the moonlight, this sandy thing glows. It's not tar, it's not black. So the road and the moor the road is a ribbon of moonlight. And it's particularly the moonlight that makes it glow like maybe satin, makes it really glow. Road is a ribbon of moonlight. It's a great one. So you're struggling with the road, but your feeling is you just started out with the idea of conveying the moor at night, the feeling of the moor at night. That's all you started. Come up with another thing to make that stronger, to make the reader really feel that. And what you come up with is abstruse, it's strange, a ribbon. So you get that. That's what you do with metaphor. And to me, it's key that you're really in between those two things. So every really juicy, wonderful, somewhat shocking metaphor is that. It's a betweenness. And as we're talking about language, it's a language betweenness. You can sort of think of other metaphors, other art forms, but let's just stick with language. What are you between? You're between two poles. It's as if there's a negative and a positive, an electrical charge in between. That's one way to think of it. It may even be somewhat the way Eliot came up with this idea of a catalyst. But you're in between. And I want to stress that what's great about this betweenness, is you don't just click it off like a logical, old school logical comparison, simile. Their hands were cold as ice, either a worn out metaphor or an old school, overly logical metaphor. Instead, what's better is you are struck by the weird feeling of it. The feeling is so good from that ribbon of moonlight that you really get the moor at night. And I'm suggesting that you get that because you're somehow in between two things. The dude standing on the moor, seeing that, and thinking of the ribbon, or even before he really gets the idea fashioned, created, he already is having a transcendent moment. You've had them. You're out in nature, or you're looking at the moon on the water, or you're at the top of a mountain or something. You're having a transcendent moment, but you're having trouble putting it in words. The feeling of the moor in the moonlight is already not the moor. It's already something else. Or you wouldn't be writing a poem. And the effective poem, and to the reader of the effective poem, it's already something else. It makes the reader think of similar moments, but possibly even dissimilar moments that have the same feeling. They weren't more, they were something else. You're already not on the moor, you're on something transcendent. At the same time, so it's not the moor. At the same time, it's not a ribbon either. The person saying this, if it comes to his mind, is it he's on the moor, or if he's like Wordsworth and it's an emotion recollected in tranquility and he's not on the moor anymore, but he's at his desk writing this poem and it comes to him to say ribbon, it's not on the moor anymore. Even when he was on the moor, he was transported. It's also not a ribbon. There's no time when he really thought it was a ribbon. It's not the moor and it's not the ribbon. When these things work, you're in between. When they work well, when the poem's really working on it, when it's transcendent, when it transports you, the reader, it's because of this betweenness. So that's the betweenness of metaphor. We've done the betweenness of language in the post-colonial sense, between Arabic and French, let's say, or Berber and French. And we've done the betweenness of exile. I think we might have a minute just to talk about something obvious that has to do with translation. Of course, and that's a word and a language thing. So it's great for this museum to be open to a topic like this. You're between two languages when you translate, but some of you may have tried this. Just as there's an enormous body of post-colonial theory that we won't go into, there's a huge body, only in the last 15 years or so, of translation theory. And in one of the key books in that area, Lawrence Venuti's book, there's a couple, you have to get the right one, by the way, to include this essay, is by William Frawley. And it's about what he calls the third code. The third code is a betweenness. If you're going from Amina Said's French to English, in what way are you in between? It's not just that you're going back and forth from one to the other. It's that your product is in between. Your experience is in between, your thinking and feeling is in between. And the poem you come up with, I would argue, is not just one of those two things, French, English. It's not just English. The source language, they call it, is French. The target language is English. I would argue that the poem you come up with, the poems that are in this book, Walking the Earth, are not just the target language. They're not just English. As you read them, certainly as they're translated, translated, you're in a between state of some kind. It may not seem like that, especially if you read a novel and the big-time publisher of the novel, say a best-selling novel, doesn't want you to feel like you're reading a translation at all. On top of that, it's not interesting metaphors, it's not poetry, it's a novel, it's prose. It was probably banged out fairly quickly. I mean, then you may feel that I'm just reading English. And if you feel that way when you're reading this translation, Walking with Them, that's fine. But to anyone who's done this, and what's interesting to me, I won't belabor the fact that I do this, but what's interesting to me is when I talk to the original poet about it, some of them are translators as well. Some of them translate from French to Arabic. And they all are open to, very expressive about something very particular, which is that the translation is a living extension of what they did. It's not a one-to-one thing where one product becomes another product. It's an opening of the original product into many possibilities. You can imagine that someone else could have translated this book a really different way. So there's that. And a couple of times I've worked through poetry with the original poet, and my English ends up being shaped by theirs. Amina Saeed's English is very good. I didn't work with her, but I worked with Véronique Tadjo and some others. Even if it weren't shaped by their English and their knowledge of English, they might object to something of it after you do it. But even if that doesn't happen, I've had a long conversation with Nabil Falaise. I've done both his novels and his poetry, where I think I've taken maybe a little bit of a liberty. Isn't that a whole topic into itself? Why wouldn't you? Why couldn't you take some liberties? Not just because there's no alternative. You can't think of, you just can't make it work in English unless you take a liberty. Why wouldn't the original poem suggest some liberties? Why would the original poem suggest more than one possibility, as I said, to translate? And these conversations with Fares was very open to that. And when I suggested I may have taken a liberty right here or right here, he goes, "Oh, beautiful, great. No, push that, push it even further." He wanted a translation that's not even particularly what he was thinking when he wrote it. Something even extended. Not more to suggest richer or better, but just extended. And that's the way to think of it. The betweenness of translation isn't just that you're zipping back and forth between one language and another. It's the being hung up in the middle. You can say, well, of course, you're hung up, your mind is sort of hung up, but what does that feel like? You're ideally going to get some of this receptive, passive thing we've been talking about in modern poetry. It gives you strong metaphors. It gives you Amina Saeed's sense of silence or absence. You're ideally, as a translator, going to be quite passive because you're taking dictation from the original, right? But I'm being encouraged by the original writer not to be that passive. At the same time, the original writers with the most perception, Fares is one of them, say, oh no, this could go any number of ways. This is just making it alive. This translation is just making it alive. Once you're done translating, it's to some extent dead again. It's now in a new form, and I'm grateful and super. But to some extent, it's static again. It's in the translating moment, in the translation, the act of translation, that it was alive again. The poem was alive again. Well, you can see how it was alive again because someone is super receptive to, and also toiling over, what does it mean? What does it really mean? What is really going on here? Right? And there's all the ways in which a poem can mean something, but dealing with all of that, maybe getting a little help from the original poet. But that's the deepest insight I've had into all this when it comes to the betweenness of translation, is that the betweenness is rich. You're working in that space. That space is where the poem is alive. And the poem may, in fact, be less alive when you're done, when you're finished with the translation. As an extension of that thought, a couple of writers have said this: your translator is the best reader you will ever have. Meaning that they are really alive in everything you said, turning it over lots of ways. Remember that any of us who reads anything, if you're monolingual and you read anything, you're reading Dickens, reading Robert Frost, we will have different interpretations, right? We've always been taught that. So there's that. But they are limited by the final form, just as the translation limits all the possibilities when it's finally done. But remember, the sense in which the translator is a good reader is that sense in which, for a while, everything is up in the air. The poem is open to a great many possibilities. The in-between state is the action of translating, but for the moment, let's call it a state there. That in-between state is the state of possibility, state of possibilities. That was the state, that's what it felt like for the original writer for a while. And the most honest of them say, when I was done, that state ended. And it's a shame in a way. And it's not exactly what I was thinking when I started. Among those honest writers, others will say, and to me, it's unfinished. I'd rather that it were unfinished. It's imperfect. What does that suggest about translation? We're talking about language. What does that suggest about language? How incredibly rich it is, multivalent. But what does that suggest about translation? That you took the thing that they felt that way about, that they felt, it's a shame that it's finished, that it's somewhat dead, and you made it alive again. At least while you're in the translating state, while you're in the in-between state, right? So I hope that's all super clear. Let's remember, though, that Said's images as the final one she comes up with, metaphors and so on. Night falling within us like a black nail. A secret dog howls in the bare book of the earth. Try being superlogical as you analyze that, but you get it right away, especially as it's embedded in this whole book. You get those metaphors right away. While these are stark and bare, there's some method there in terms of what both she and Jawad said about silence, absence, what I said about receptivity in the Salvador Dali sense, what Keats said about negative capability. But it's even more than that. So much is stripped away from a thematic point of view, from what might be more flowery, more colorful imagery, from what might be more assertive and, obviously emphatic language. So much is stripped away from that. That it's the emblem of what's stripped away from these people, the people in the book that are walking there. A lot is stripped away from them. So the writing style reflects that. That's a good takeaway. I'm just about done. But that's a good takeaway for this book, right? And the image of Beckett, if you've read a lot of him, particularly if you read the novels, Samuel Beckett, is very much the same thing. We don't leave it there. My last thought on this was to say that that's what's stripped away from them, and it's reflected in the stripped down language. It doesn't leave us with a super positive feeling. But there's a way in which it's very hard to say how this works without reading the book, but there's a way in which stripping certain things away from their humanity brings into relief certain qualities of their humanity as they stagger on. Remember, Beckett's famous for saying, I can't go on, I'll go on. So it's brought into relief by the style and language. Is hope and courage. Thanks. So now Emily and Laura will guide us. We may do some questions and answers.
Certainly. So anyone, please feel free to drop your questions into the chat or even just raise your hand. You have a question that you would like to ask. Maybe I can go ahead and get started with the question that I had, which is, speaking of somebody who writes poetry as a hobby, one of the hardest things to know is just when is a poem really finished, because I'm often going back and tweaking what I've written and swapping words out or adding lines, and eventually you get the feeling that you're good to go. But when you're translating poetry, um, how do you assess when a translation is really finished, when you've really captured all the layers of meaning from the original poem and evoked the same sort of imagery? Because I'm sure that you don't just take one pass through and then it's translated, not with something as complicated as poetry.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it maybe is a little easier than when you write your own poetry.
Mhm.
When you write your own, there's something very rich. Let's think of the person on the moor in the moonlight, and you're just really struggling to capture that. But when I pick someone that I think has already captured that, I'm a little more likely to get through the technical aspects of it and then think, oh, okay, that's the best I can do, or that's one interpretation based on what we just finished saying. That's one way of doing this. I don't like the way I did it. It certainly encompasses what was going on, and I may come back to it. When you do your own, it's more like for days you're thinking of it still with you, and you're still sort of not sure. You're liking what you did. That's part of it. Quite pleased with yourself, and you're rejuvenating certain feelings and stuff. But that all can engender some tweaks and revisits and stuff. Very rich. It's I'm a little less likely to do that when I'm translating.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions?
I notice one of the people on the call is Alexandra Gold. She's a wonderful publicist for Contramundum. Because I keep thinking I'll forget to tell her this personally, that she thought of getting in touch with you. It's just fabulous.
Well, we're glad that she did. Yeah. I mean, just want to speak, it's not exactly a question, but there were so many things that you brought up, Peter, that made me really think about, a lot of matters relating to exile and, language gaps and things like that. I mean, it's really a rich presentation and it was very thought-provoking. I mean, we had another poem that we publicized on our website that was originally written in Spanish and then by a Mexican poet. And he was talking about the issues of exile for like Mexican immigrants coming to the United States, and that they had a foot in their own culture and then a foot in the new culture. And it was a very moving poem. We were pleased he allowed us to publicize it. Um, and the issues of imposed languages made me recall experiencing. I'm really an Asian studies person, and I spent time in Taiwan and in China. And the Taiwanese were first colonized by the Japanese, and then schools they were forced to all the instruction was in Japanese, and then at home they spoke Taiwanese, which is like a different language from Chinese, you know. And when I was over there studying in Taiwan 40 some years ago, um, a lot of the older people who had to learn Japanese in school, they still spoke Japanese, and I didn't speak Taiwanese, but we could communicate in Japanese. It was a common language that we had. Even I mean, there's so many issues like this that I think, encompass many cultures and many issues of immigration and government. I mean, in the United States today, as everybody knows, I mean, there's immigration is like this huge issue, political issue. That's just a big conflict right now. So I just want to thank you for giving us the benefit of your thoughts and all your work on these subjects. I found it personally to be very enriching and um, very, very interesting. So I want to thank you and Alexandra. And I know that I kind of butchered the name of the press, Contra Mundum Press, when I was introducing you. Sorry about that. Um, but that was just a slip of the tongue on my part. So
I'm
um,
wondering, Laura, is the Mexican poet you mentioned, is that part of a presentation it's in your archive that we can look at?
yes, yes. I mean, yeah, the poem, yeah. Uh, it's, uh, it's uh, it's on our website. We will send you the link to the poem. We have the poem in the original Spanish, and we have an English translation, and there's even a video of it, which is uh, that they provided us. It's pretty interesting. So we'll send you a link to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I hope you guys do more, there are other ways to do translation, but I hope you take in some other prose or poet translators and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I
And
mean,
obviously you could have someone do translation theory. Might be a little drier.
yeah. Yeah. Well, we have a connection with the American Translators Association.
Yeah.
One of our we have liaisons around the country, and so we have a liaison with the American Translators Association. So, I mean, I've often thought that a lot of the um, emphasis when people think of a foreign language, they think of foreign language teaching. And I feel there's a big gap and there's not enough emphasis on translating and interpreting, which are very important parts of the language field as well, aside from, teaching the language. Uh, so we do try to kind of cover some of these areas that may not be covered as much. Um, you were talking about the issues of say people don't want to write in Berber or uh, I don't know, various kinds of street language that isn't really written. Um, that's a big issue. This whole issue of language extinction,
Yeah.
because there isn't writing in it, so it's not preserved in a written form,
Yeah.
and then it gets lost. That's a big issue. Um,
I heard something
yeah,
that the language goes extinct every 2 weeks. Is that something you've heard?
yeah, yeah. We have a we have an intern working with us from Hawaii, and he's a native speaker of Hawaiian. I mean, he's a college student, but he grew up on Molokai, one of the smaller islands. He went to bilingual school, and he has a mission in his mind to try to work towards um, preserving the Hawaiian language as a real language. I mean, it's one of the more successful ones of in terms of keeping it alive, a language which was close to going extinct. But it's very interesting talking to him about a lot of language issues and when we have like our online meetings and so on. So yeah, we're trying to reach out to in a lot of different areas. I see Sydney. Sydney's one of our interns. Sydney, do you want to turn on your camera? This is Sydney. She's a student at Barnard College, and she's an intern working with us, and she knows French quite well. And I think she has a question. Is that right? You have a question, Sydney?
I just wanted to note too on Hawaii, since I also have family there, Hawaiian pidgin is also very spoken. So I have long-term American relatives that are also illiterate, and there's just no written language and everything. So I just kind of wanted to note that that's even very present in America and American colonization that has now resulted in so much use of English, as you're noting there as well. Um, and yeah, I really appreciate kind of that sort of discussion. And if we ever want to talk about it more, I'd be happy to work on that sort of thing as well. I think it's a very interesting field and want to express my gratitude there as well.
Sure.
Oh, I know that when you were studying the poems of Amina Said, as which we asked you to work on for us, you had a question about this issue about the black nail and what the significance of that was. So do you feel that you got an answer?
Oh, which it was talked about, but wasn't it? I had just on my first read wasn't sure if there was any particular. I had the thought of could there be an allusion to Jesus on the cross? Could there be like the thought of a coffin, a nail in the coffin? I wasn't sure if there was any connections like that, just because I thought it was such an interesting imagery in particular. It kind of jumped out to me.
Yeah. Yeah, to me, the more you think about it, the more your logical mind is taking over.
Of course.
Me, it's more a question of passivity. And if you enjoy poetry, not everyone does. But if you get in kind of a zone where it's beyond logic, we can say things about a black male that sort of, as I did, sort of feel like something cold dropping within you. But I hadn't thought, okay, I could ask Amina Said, I could ask her if you want. Did you think of a coffin nail? I doubt she was being quite that logical, but that's all. And
Yeah, that was interesting because it was contrasted too with so much like organic imagery, and there was this, yes, you're the cold and the warmth, the light and the dark, that sort of thing.
yeah, remember everything's in play. There's lots of things that come out of an image. That's great.
Okay, go ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you. So we're very grateful to have you, Peter Thompson. It's been a pleasure working with your poetry. It's definitely very important, as Laura mentioned, to have representation for translation and interpretation. It is a part of that umbrella of language advocacy and making sure that there is a bridge between different communities to understand one another and expand our own perspectives of life. And one way is definitely through art, through poetry, and to see your take on the translation of Amina Said's poetry is definitely very important. And I'd love to hear from you if you have any tips for newer generation of translators, maybe anything that can support us on our path to be better translators in our process.
Sure. Well, I have many tips, maybe too many. I know how much you've done, and we have maybe a minute or two. But there are translation workshops. I did some in grad school, and they're very interesting. You can be experienced or not experienced. But you'll bring your work and, it'll get critiqued the way it does in any workshop, but you'll also get a dose of theory. And if it's led by a translator, you'll get a dose of a sense of alternatives that you may not have thought of. Translation is all about alternatives. And when you are just starting, maybe you don't have enough of those in your head, But the other thing is just like any literature endeavor, you've got to read just tons. If there's a field you like North Africa, you got to go there. You got to be in bookstores. You got to talk to writers, and you read constantly. Every idea that I've ever had comes from other writers. Just as a literature, if you're an English major, it's the same way. If you make that your life, you read one thing after another because someone recommended it, because some great writer said one very particular thing about it. And that's how I work. So I've discovered, I've been slightly disappointed by one or two people that I translated. I kind of wish I hadn't, but usually it's a fascinating thing, and then just knowing them, it leads to other things. Generally, it's way richer than I thought it would be, way better than I thought it would be. So I want to stress that what I thought you were going to say actually is translating Arab women, something I've done, I think 4 times, is underrepresented, underexplored. And so people like you, that's a huge field. You run into the problem that they don't get published in their own country as much as they should. That's, by the way, that's sometimes why they publish in France. But if you are a reader of French, you can work within that space, right? And you can get them an English audience as well.
Well, there are many avenues we could pursue on this subject. And again, we want to thank you very much for giving us the time, and thank Alexandra for helping facilitate us, and Greg reaching out to you, Greg, our former president, reaching out to you and setting up the event.